IELTS Writing Task 1, Lesson 7, Process Diagram. Process diagrams show steps or stages in a process. You'll see something like this. We have steps and arrows between the steps. The most common type of process in IELTS Writing Task 1 is a man-made process, a factory process, producing something. For example, producing glass, how glass is made, or producing a food, how a type of food is produced. And the steps would show how those processes happen. If you see an arrow here, this becomes a cycle, a process that continues. This is more common for natural cycles, such as the water cycle or the life cycle of a butterfly. It's possible that you could see a natural cycle question in your IELTS test, but this is less common than the man-made process questions. However, the technique is the same. We're still describing steps or stages one by one. Describing a process is completely different from describing a graph, bar chart, pie chart or table. Let's look quickly at some differences. No numbers. You won't see any numbers in a process diagram. You can't compare anything. You're just looking at steps one after the other. There's nothing to compare. And you can't describe trends, increase, decrease. There's nothing going up or going down. So we can't do most of the things that we usually do. So what can we describe? Well, we can say how many steps there are. We can say where the process begins and ends. And we can describe each step in the process in detail. So all we're doing is talking about the steps. Look at them in general, how many. Look at where the process begins and ends, and then go into detail. That's what we need to do for this type of task. One other thing to look at is the language for process descriptions. Some special language. There's two main things that are different here. First, steps language, and second, the passive verbs. Let's look at steps language first. This is quite easy. When you're describing a process, you've got step 1, step 2, step 3. You need to organize your description. So you'll use words like at the first stage in the process begins with, secondly, finally, the second step involves, next, then, after that, at the following stage. All of this type of phrase I would call steps language. The other special language for process descriptions is passive verbs. Let's look at some examples with a sample question. Imagine we have these steps, and these steps show the process of glass recycling. If we take one of the steps and say it's glass collection, how do we put that into the passive? Well, glass is collected. Notice we use the verb to be in the present, is in this case, and then the past participle. Glass is collected. Instead of using the active, which would be people collect the glass, it's better in this case to say glass is collected. And if we add some steps language to this to say that this is step 1, we get this sentence. At the first stage in the process, glass is collected. That's a typical sentence that you might write for a process diagram description. Let's look at another example with step 2. Imagine this is sorting by hand. We could write an active sentence, which would be, next, people sort the glass by hand. Or we could write a passive. I would prefer the passive in this case. The passive would be, next, the collected glass is sorted by hand, instead of using the word people. We don't need to talk about the people. We can say the glass as the subject. The glass is sorted. Another example, grinding machine. Now, I've included this example because you might not know the past participle of the verb grind. Let's look at the active sentence possibilities first. You could write, a machine grinds the glass, or the glass passes through a grinding machine. If you don't want to use the verb grind, you're not sure about it, change it. The glass passes through. However, if you want to do this in the passive, do you know the passive for grind? Well, if you don't, you could use pass again in the passive. The glass is passed through a grinding machine. And finally, if you do know the past participle of the verb grind, you could write, the glass is ground in a machine. You can see it's an irregular verb there. The glass is ground in a machine, or a longer sentence, the sorted glass is then ground in a machine. And this is a good sentence for a process diagram description. One more thing to note before we continue to our question, and that is that maps can also show processes. A map is just a type of diagram, and a map can show steps or stages. I'll show you a simple example now. Imagine we have a map showing growth of a city, and this circle represents the city in the years 1700 to 1890. So that was the old area of the city. Then the city grew in the years 1891 to 1950, and then it got even bigger in the years 1951 to 2011. So you can see there the city has grown in 3 steps. So it's a process. We've got 3 stages and we can describe them in the normal way. An example sentence, at the second stage of development from 1891 to 1950, the city grew in a northerly direction. So you can see steps language in this sentence, at the second stage of, but we can't see the passive in this sentence. The verb is grew, and that's because we have a clear subject. The city grew. So maybe the only difference with map questions is that you might not use the passive as much. You might not use it at all because we have a good subject. The city grew. The city became bigger. The city developed. So don't worry about map questions. They can show processes. They can show other things which we'll look at in the next lesson. But if you get a process map with stages, just use today's lesson and think of it as a process description. Now let's move on to today's process diagram question. Here's the question. Let's look at the question statement at the top first. The diagrams below show how glass containers such as bottles are produced and recycled. You can see 2 grey boxes. We've got glass production with 4 steps in the top box and glass recycling in 5 steps in the bottom box. And our job is to describe those 2 processes. Let's follow our usual approach and write 4 paragraphs. One thing to make sure of in your process diagram descriptions is that paragraph 2, the overview or summary, is good. Most people forget the overview when they're describing a process. We mustn't forget it. Let's start with the introduction as usual, paraphrase the question. Here's the question, and we'll start with the first small phrase, the diagrams below show. And I've changed that to the first flow diagram illustrates. We'll talk about the second diagram later. How glass containers such as bottles are produced, the process of glass container production. And recycled, well, first I need to say, and the second diagram shows steps in the process of recycling used glass. And that's my introduction finished. The first flow diagram illustrates the process of glass container production, and the second diagram shows steps in the process of recycling used glass. On to the overview now, 2 sentences, 2 main points, and I'll show you on the diagrams what I'm going to choose. I'm going to talk about, in my overview, these 3 materials that are the main materials that go into glass production, and I'm going to say that there are 4 steps in glass production and 5 steps in glass recycling. That's all. For your overview, for processes, the main thing is to count the steps. You can say something else about the first step, maybe the last step, or in this case the materials, but that's all you need to worry about. My first sentence of the overview, we can see that glass is made using 3 main raw materials, and that the manufacturing process consists of 4 distinct stages. It requires 5 steps to turn used glass into new glass products. You can see there 2 sentences. In the first one I've talked about glass production and the materials, and in the second sentence I've talked about the steps in glass recycling. And that's my overview finished. And now we can go on to the details paragraphs 3 and 4. We'll start with paragraph 3 and look at the diagrams to see what we'll put in this paragraph. I think it's very easy. We'll choose the glass production steps for paragraph 3, and later for paragraph 4 we'll do the recycling steps. So paragraph 3, 3 sentences as usual. The first one, at the first stage in the production of glass, sand, soda ash, limestone and other chemicals are mixed together. Second sentence, next, this mixture is heated in a glass furnace at approximately 1500 degrees C to produce molten glass. Third sentence, the molten glass can then be shaped by blowing to create the end products, namely glass containers. And that's paragraph 3 finished. Let's have a quick look at the steps language, at the first stage in, next, then, and also using the words end products represents the final step. Let's look at the passive language, passive verbs in this paragraph. We've got are mixed, is heated, can be shaped. Okay, on to paragraph 4. The same thing. We're going to choose the glass recycling steps for this paragraph, of course. The first sentence that I wrote, glass recycling begins with the collection of used glass products. Second sentence, the collected glass is sorted according to its colour and then washed in order to remove any impurities. At the fourth stage of recycling, the glass is crushed and melted, and the resulting molten glass can finally be moulded to create new items. Let's look at the steps language in here. We've got begins with, and then, at the fourth stage, and finally. Another thing about steps that's interesting in this paragraph is what I've done, for example, with the collection. I've turned this noun in the next sentence into an adjective, the collected glass. It's a good way of linking the steps together. You've got a noun of something that happens in one step, and then in the next step that has been done already, so it becomes an adjective. Another example of how this works, melted, and then later the resulting molten glass. So there was a verb this time, it was melted, and then it becomes an adjective, the molten glass, the resulting molten glass. So it's a nice way of connecting the steps again to turn a noun or verb into an adjective in the next step. Let's look at the passive in this paragraph finally. We've got is sorted and washed, is crushed and melted, can be moulded. And that's the end of the whole report because, as usual, we don't have a conclusion. Let's look now at the vocabulary as we usually do. This time we need to look at paraphrasing, steps language and passive verbs, and maybe one or two other good items of vocabulary that I used in the report. We've got steps or stages in the process of, consists of 4 distinct stages, it requires 5 steps, raw materials, end products. I almost always use those 2 phrases in this type of report because a man-made factory process starts with raw materials and always ends with end products. Production, manufacturing, Turn used glass into new products. Turn into means to transform something. At the first stage, next, then, begins with, that's our steps language. Are mixed, is heated, can be shaped. Those are the passive verb structures. Is sorted according to. Can be moulded to create. Are mixed, this mixture. Collection, the collected glass. Is melted, the resulting molten glass. Those last three examples I talked about where we have one step and then it's used as an adjective in the next step. In the case of mixture, it's used as a noun in the next step. So those are the good words and phrases that I think an examiner would be impressed by and would really notice, and that is what would really help this essay to get a very high score, a band 9. That's the end of this lesson about process diagrams. Please print the worksheet, watch the lesson again, and analyse each sentence carefully to make sure you've understood. There was a lot of information about process diagrams in this lesson. In the next lesson, we'll look at comparison diagrams. Instead of showing a process, it will be two diagrams that you can compare.